Alright, I've decided that now is as good of a time as any to speak about all the settings that you can find in V-Ray cameras. We put them in already. Now let me just talk about some of the settings. It won't completely make sense until we go fully into V-Ray lighting too, because they go hand in hand, but we'll go over them now. So remember, if you select on the camera name here, the plus mark, and hit select camera, we'll go into the camera, or of course you can go to the top view and select it as well. Okay, if you are familiar with actual digital cameras or any kind of camera, then you'll probably understand a lot of this stuff. If you're not, then it might be very foreign to you. But there's a few important things that we can go over that will help those of you who aren't familiar. So exposure is how much light is being let into the camera, and so it will affect how light or how dark your scene is. Some of the settings that affect exposure are f number and shutter speed right here. Okay, so shutter speed, when you set that to 200, that's actually 1/200th of a second is what that's, and that's similar to normal cameras. Vignetting, you can turn, this is different than a regular camera, but regular lenses do have vignetting, which means the corners get kind of darker or underexposed a little bit. You can turn that on and off here, or you can set it between 1 and 0 for, apparently you can set it higher than that. I'm not sure why you would. Usually I would just do the vignetting effect if you want it in Photoshop and just leave it entirely off here. And you can see exposure can be checked on or off, which means you could change all your shutter speed, your f number, all those things without it affecting how much light your scene is going to have. And that's actually what I usually do. And I'll show you why. You can, if you understand all this stuff, you can leave exposure on and set your f number exactly how you want it. Okay, so why would you even want to mess with f number and shutter speed? That is because it affects your depth of field, how blurry things are, or how big the area of focus is going to be, basically. And then the shutter speed affects how blurry things that are in motion are going to be. So right here you can turn on depth of field and motion blur. So if something, you've probably seen pictures where something is moving fast across the screen. If your shutter speed opens and closes in 1/1000th of a second, so if this was set to 1000, that thing's not going to blur very much because it can be captured very, very quickly. But also your scene's going to be pretty dark because it's only your shutter is only open for 1/1000th of a second. If you're not doing any motion blur, then none of that's even going to matter to you, except for the exposure of your scene, but then you can turn off exposure as well. So these are kind of the settings. So f number and shutter speed are the ones that you're going to mess with the most, and then of course there's the zoom, the focal length, zooming in and out. Okay, and then the vertical shift that I already showed you, where you can guess vertical shift. So those are the main things you're going to mess with, and changing either one of these numbers, if exposure is checked, shutter speed or f number, will change how much light your scene is going to have in it. I actually turn this off, and this is actually good for beginners. If you just turn this off, and then only affect how much light your scene is getting by what you set your lights to. So this just takes out a lot of the other factors when you're trying to light your scene, and you only have to concentrate in the settings of your lights. If you have exposure turned on, you have to worry about what your f number is, what your shutter speed is, what your lights are set to, how powerful they are, and all those factors will affect how much light you're getting in your scene. So to make it easier for yourself, you can just turn off exposure. Now, however, if you want motion blur or depth of field, let me show you some examples of that real quick. Okay, I did a quick search for depth of field, and I just searched Google Images, and this is what came up. So this is a perfect example. You can see this garden gnome back here is in perfect focus, and this one is completely out of focus. Everything behind him is out of focus. So it's just that little chunk, that distance from the camera that is in focus. So that's your depth of field. If you set your f numbers to something higher, like 20, then your depth of field is going to be large. In other words, a huge area will be in focus, a huge amount of depth. If you set it to something low, it'll let a lot more light in. Your exposure will go way up, but your area that's going to be in focus is going to be very low. Of course, that will only happen if you check depth of field on, like that. Otherwise, it'll just let a lot more light in, but not even affect how much it's blurred. Okay. Now an example of motion blur. Okay, here's an example of motion blur. These dice are, well, this one is rolling, and so you can see that when the camera snaps the picture, everything is kind of blurred in the direction that it's moving. That's motion blur, and that's affected by how fast your shutter opens and closes. So if your shutter speed's at 1/200th of a second, may or may not catch some of that blur. But again, motion blur would have to be checked here in order for it to even do anything in your V-Ray camera. So if you want to do motion blur and depth of field effects, you'd have to click these on. Blurring takes a ton of render time, or a ton of power, by the way. And then you'd have to set your shutter speed and your f numbers to be right. And remember, both of these also affect your exposure. So you have some different options here. You can turn off exposure so that they're not affecting that, and turn on your blur effects. So you're thinking, I just want a lot of blur, but I don't want it to affect how much light my camera's getting. And you could just put your shutter speed down to 1/10th of a second, and you'll catch a lot of blur that way. The same goes for f number. If I want my depth of field to be really small, so just this corner right here in focus, I could set my f number very low. Actually, 1 is pretty low, but I don't want that to change my exposure of my scene. Then I could just uncheck that, make sure this is checked down here. Of course, you could turn this on, get all your settings just right, just as if you were taking a real picture with a real camera. Or you can make it so it's only affecting the exposure by turning these off. So there's a lot of different things you can do, and just like a regular camera you might be familiar with, you can also change the film speed, or the ISO setting basically, which is somewhere here. Oh, you can, if you're doing depth of field stuff, you can specify your focus like this. That's kind of like the manual focus on your camera. White balance. Okay, so white balance, just like a regular camera, you can do custom balances here. You can change them in here. So if your scene's coming out really yellow and you're not sure why, then change your white balance. I usually use neutral. You can kind of affect that in Photoshop after this. Here's the ISO setting. So 100 is pretty low. 800 is faster, which means that the exposure the sensor will be more sensitive, basically. So a slower exposure at 800 or a faster exposure at 800 will still give pretty good exposure. But if the speed is only at 100, then that will not give very much exposure at all, because the sensor is not as sensitive at that setting. So that's kind of confusing. Like I said, if you know about regular cameras, then you'll understand this more. But those are the basic settings. I wouldn't mess with much of this if you're a beginner. You might just turn off exposure, get your zoom right, make sure your vertical shift is right, and then if you want to get fancy, you can go into the depth of field and motion blur settings. So that's the basic rundown on V-Ray cameras. Sorry I don't have a little more time to go into photography lessons, but this should get you through with what you need to know about V-Ray physical cameras.